Hello and welcome back to Psychology 301 Learning. This is Dr. Williams, and this is the lecture for Unit 1D. Today we're going to be talking about fixed and modal action patterns. So let's talk about, we've kind of defined what a fixed and modal action patterns are. We've talked about examples, but I want to get into them a little bit deeper. And my first question that I'd like to discuss is what releases a modal action pattern? When we talk about reflexes, we talk about a release or stimulus. There's a stimulus response, a specific stimulus response relationship, and there's the same kind of stimulus response relationship with modal action patterns. There are stimuli that are responsible. And so what exactly is required for a modal action pattern to actually be released? And the first part of the answer has to do with an internal state of readiness. This is not a requirement for reflexes, but for modal action patterns, they tend to occur during certain times of the year. So for example, breeding season and food storing season, the time to find mates, the time to fend off other males from your territory. So there are certain internal states of readiness that are really necessary for a modal action pattern that doesn't actually exist for reflexes. So for example, modal action patterns may only appear in one gender. For example, they may only appear in males, or they might only appear in females. And so that would mean that you have to have the right gender in order for you to get the behavior. Also, there may be something about hormones. A lot of modal action patterns are seasonal and are tied to the breeding season. And so for an individual to be capable of engaging in a modal action pattern, for example, they have to be adults. They have to have the appropriate hormonal state in order for the modal action pattern to even occur. So they may not only happen in males, but it may only happen in males, but it may only happen in adult males. And then of course there's deprivation. There have been lots of experiments that show that it gets easier to elicit a modal action pattern when the subject has been deprived of whatever the stimulus is. So if it's access to other males during the breeding season when they're aggressive, then it'll be really easy to get a modal action pattern out of a male that hasn't seen another male for a while. So there's something about being internally ready to perform a modal action pattern that's necessary for action patterns, but that's not necessary for reflexes. Reflexes are not necessarily seasonal, and they have very little to do with our hormonal states, and deprivation has nothing to do with them. So this is one of those places where the two types of genetically determined behaviors are different from each other. It's also true that you may need the appropriate context. So for example, you may have an animal who is the right gender, the right hormones, and it's time to store food, and so food caching is the behavior. You may be more likely to get it, but you're probably not going to get it unless you provide them with an appropriate foraging setting. So sometimes the environmental context is really important. And then finally, in addition to all those other things, you have to have the right stimulus. So for an animal that's trying to forage and cache food, there has to be nuts or seeds or whatever they're going to be storing. And for a male stickleback fish who's preparing to go into the breeding season, everything may be right. The gender, the hormone, the deprivation state, the nesting setting is all correct, but you don't get the aggression until there's another male present, or you don't get the courtship behaviors unless there's a female present. So, and that particular sign stimulus is really important. It's a very specific releaser stimulus that reliably elicits a modal action pattern when all of these other conditions are met. So what are some types of releaser stimuli? Well, they vary. There's a lot. They fall into lots of different categories, but One big category is whether or not the releaser stimulus is intraspecific or interspecific. Intraspecific means that the stimulus comes from within the species. So it might be the presence of another male or the presence of a female. Interspecific behaviors might be modal action patterns that are elicited by the presence of a predator or of a prey. And so sometimes it's between species and sometimes it's within the same species. So there are several. Here are 4 of the categories that I came up with. There are social releasers. So vocalizations. Vocalization is an important part of bird life and other primate life as well. And so territorial calls, primate duets, gibbons engage in elaborate duets. Lemurs engage in group howling. And of course, birdsong is super important for the mating season. Scent marking is another one. Scent marking is a social behavior. It identifies your territory. It identifies and it carries with it a lot of information about you. It may identify your gender. It may identify your sexual receptiveness or breeding receptiveness. So there's a lot of information that can be transmitted through scent marking. Morphology and behavior. It's very interesting that it's not just behavior that has evolved over time in terms of modal action patterns, but following on the heels of the behavior change comes physical changes in the body. We look at some of these elaborate male birds are absolutely stunning to look at. Their physical evolution has gone to incredible lengths to make them attractive, just as females have often undergone the opposite to make them as drab and camouflaged as possible. So if you're walking around Ellensburg and you see a male European robin with a great big orange breast on the front, that orange breast identifies him as an adult, sexually active, competitive male. The red patch on the 3-spine stickleback male's belly. When you see big fins like in Siamese fighting fish, you see antlers and feather displays. Siamese fighting fish are amazing. Their faces blow up, their fins get really big, they're very colorful, and they use those to compete male to male. When they see another male, they puff up and they try to look big and scary. Diana's guenons, they're a type of monkey, and they have a line on their thigh, and that line, it's a white line, it's a big white stripe, and researchers have determined that from far away, the angle of that stripe signifies where you are in the social hierarchy. So how you actually sit and how you sit displays at a distance what your social hierarchy is. Lots of insects, moths, fish have false eye spots that are designed to redirect a predator away from the head and toward the wings or the fins. Food items can serve as releaser stimuli. Corvid birds and squirrels respond to food, whether it's nuts or seeds or berries. Nesting material. I don't know if you've ever deliberately put out nesting material for birds, but during the breeding season, you can actually facilitate nests in your area by providing them with nesting materials, and they will come and take them. They feel compelled to come and take them, especially if they're soft and fluffy, and they will definitely come and get them. So it's kind of a neat thing. So let me show you just a few pictures that'll kind of exemplify this. So vocalization, a powerful modal action pattern, whether it is, this is a howler monkey on the right. They're South American howler monkeys, and their call can be heard for up to like 5 miles away. You can hear them. Here's a European robin, and I don't know if any of you have dogs, but do your dogs howl when they hear other dogs? So that's a kind of modal action pattern that dogs, in fact, dogs will even respond to uh, fire engines or police sirens because they're in the same frequency. And so they're responding. It's kind of a compelling behavior for animals. And the more closely they are related to wolves, the more likely they are to engage in these behaviors. So you hear it a lot from huskies and shepherds and behavior dogs like that. Okay, morphology, here's my example. So we have antlers. This could be a release or stimulus for aggressive behavior in males. You have this big peacock tail behavior. They actually have to physically raise that tail. And so that raising of the tail is actually the modal action pattern. I just wanted to demonstrate these beautiful feather patterns on ducks, in particular on waterfowl, are quite amazing. And sometimes their behavior will include not only the fact that they have these colors, but their behaviors will use the color patterns to create interesting displays. Sometimes ducks will raise a wing and point with their beak underneath their wing at a flashy spot that might be underneath their wing. And then here we have false eye spots in, this is a butterfly and here's a fish. And the idea is there's camouflage over the eye, which is where the head is. And then there's a great big eye back here that looks like an eye to redirect a predator toward that part of their body. So this is just, and some of these animals actually learn to wiggle these spots and manipulate these spots when they're in a threatening situation. So it's very interesting how they have evolved all of these physical and behavioral techniques. And not only do you get these behaviors, but the presence of these behaviors can serve as an action pattern as well. So it can be a releaser and an action pattern. The antlers, for example, can be the releaser for another male who then comes to attack this guy. But one of the best ones is the three-spined stickleback. And I said that we would come back to him, and here we are. We're back with Nico Tinbergen and his three-spined stickleback fish. And he noticed in his laboratory, he had lots and lots of aquariums. He liked to study fish, and so he had lots of aquariums. And he noticed that the male three-spined sticklebacks in the spring would suddenly become aggressive when red trucks would drive by the laboratory windows. And the modal action pattern that he saw looked very much like the aggression that they direct toward other males in the territory. And so he became curious about what was the stimulus. I mean, clearly you have another male with a red belly and that's enough to get the behavior going. But why the red fire trucks? It didn't seem to make sense. And so he conducted an experiment where he used models. He used simplified, they're called supernormal stimuli. So he took stimuli and simplified the stimulus and exaggerated parts of the stimulus to see what would happen. And he conducted this experiment, and I'll show you this in a sec. I'll give you more details in a minute. But you'll notice that in the breeding season, the male will, he's prepared and he's got modal action patterns up his sleeve. But in the presence of another male, he becomes aggressive. But in the presence of a female who does not have a red belly, here's a female with no red belly, he becomes arduous and begins his courtship displays. So it really depends not only on his state of readiness and the right environment and all of those other things, but the stimulus has to be the right one. And in some cases, there's more than one stimulus, and each one initiates a different modal action pattern. So there are two examples here that I want to talk about because I have some videos of this. And so there's the gray-legged goose example and the three-spined stickleback example. So I want to talk about these just for a second, and then you can go watch them. So I'm going to start with the three-spined stickleback because I think it's the first one in the list. So this is just a simulation of Nico Tinbergen's study. What he did was he created models, and he put them on sticks and lowered them into the aquarium of a male that was in the breeding season. And he used a model that looked just like another fish, but it looked like another male, but it didn't have a red belly. It's just a plain, boring male. And then he introduced these weird shapes, all kinds of weird, funny shapes made out of clay with the bottoms painted red. And each of them is on a stick. And so you'll get to see this and see what happens. The way he does not respond to the male with no red belly, and the aggressiveness with which he goes after these blobs of clay with red bellies. Very interesting. And then the second video I'd like you to watch is the one about the gray lag goose egg retrieval. So gray lag geese to have a tendency when they're sitting on their nest, if there's an egg right here, you can see there's a little egg out in front of this goose sitting on the nest. And so the goose will actually get up and lean over and use its bill to roll the egg gradually back into the nest. But what's so interesting, and interesting not only about the sign stimulus, but the supernormal stimulus, is how little like an egg that item has to be to provoke this behavior. It really just needs to be kind of egg-sized and near the nest when a bird's sitting on it. And so I want you to go watch this. It's amazing what you'll see, and how bizarre the stimuli can be. It's really interesting. So go watch the supplemental videos for Unit 1D. Pause the video here, and then go watch the supplemental videos, but only watch these two because there's another one and I'm going to talk about it later in the thing, and I'll wait here for you to come back. All right. Okay, welcome back. All right. So I want to move on and show you a couple more pictures and then talk about the difference between modal action patterns and reflexes. So one of the examples I gave you was a fighting fish, the Siamese fighting fish, and you can see how big and ugly their faces get. When they see another male, they engage in this behavior where they puff up and rush and bite, kind of like the stickleback does. Here are some examples of food as a sign stimulus for storage. Down here on so we have some corvid birds, crows, ravens, jays, magpies, all store food, and squirrels, of course. But here is this is a cache. It's like this big treasure trove of little tiny pine cones. Oh, make any squirrel happy. Another example of an actual MAP is some work by Irenaeus Eibels-Einsfeld, German researcher, who studied lots of animals, but in particular studied spiders. And he studied spiders who weave egg cases. I've only put a picture up because I looked at videos and I thought they were too creepy. But certain spiders, a lot of spiders, spin webs, and we know about their web spinning, but they also spin egg cases, and you can see the egg case up here in the upper right-hand corner, upper left-hand corner right here. And so depending on the type of spider, they spin this little egg case, and it actually is kind of like they spin a little top on it and attach it to a leaf, and then they spin down the sides and they start to weave they start sort of weaving it into, it's almost like a tube sock. I mean, it's got this opening, and they will lay their eggs up into that tube sock and then weave it shut and then move away. And Einsfeld wanted to know, gee, I wonder what you would do if we interrupted you. And so he was working with this spider, and the spider was weaving its web and weaving its spider case and its egg case. And it started with the bottom and started working up the sides. And then it went to, before it went to lay its eggs, he reached over with a pair of scissors and he snipped the bottom of it off so that it was open at the bottom. And he, and he thought, well, a smart spider will go back and fix it before she lays her eggs. But she didn't. She just continued weaving her egg case. She laid her eggs in it with a hole in the bottom. The eggs fell through, and she closed it up, attached it to a leaf, and walked away as if she had completed the whole cycle. But her eggs went splat on the ground. And so he became super interested. So he started conducting systematic investigations of this egg case weaving behavior. And in one set of experiments, he removed the spider's silk organ. So he went in and removed the organ that creates the silk. And then he allowed those spiders to recover, and they went into their breeding season. And these female spiders would begin spinning their egg cases, but they didn't have any silk. So it was like a pantomime. It was like they would just be like weaving with nothing in their between their little feet, and they would weave and weave and weave. And then when it got to the point where she would have naturally been weaving the sides of this thing, she laid her eggs in midair and then continued this pantomime of closing the egg case and attaching it to a leaf. And so these studies really showed how fixed and rigid these modal action patterns are. Once they get started, it's really hard to stop them or to interrupt them or make them start over. Some of them are so fixed. I mean, in this case, you know, spiders don't normally weave their egg cases when they don't have a silk organ. And so they're clearly an artificial situation, a laboratory situation. But the fact that she couldn't adjust her behavior to accommodate the fact that she didn't have a silk organ, she went through I mean, why lay your eggs at all? But she went ahead and went through the whole process and laid her eggs in midair and lost her eggs. So very interesting studies that speak to the power of the rigidity of modal action patterns. Okay, the difference between modal action patterns and reflexes. All right, so let's just compare them. Reflexes on the left, modal action patterns on the right. Reflexes are usually present at birth. Modal action patterns typically don't emerge until after birth, and often many of them at sexual maturity. Reflexes are independent of a motivational state, and modal action patterns often depend heavily on motivational state and hormones. So you have to have the correct internal state of readiness for a modal action pattern and not so for a reflex. Reflexes are dependent on the reflex arc, and remember, they don't require any cerebral involvement, they just happen. That's not true for modal action patterns. Modal action patterns are so, they're such complex sequences of behavior that a single neuron at the level of the spine is not sufficient to be able to manage all of that behavior. And so it does require cerebral involvement, and it involves lots of neurons, not just three. Reflexes are relatively simple behaviors, but that's not the case for modal action patterns. They're very complex behaviors, and they're entire sequences of behaviors. And reflexes involve only a few muscles and glands, whereas the modal action patterns often involve the entire organism. Everything about them is involved. Now, they are similar. Both modal action patterns and reflexes require a releaser stimulus. They both have adaptive value. They're both innate forms of behavior. They're passed on genetically. They're hardwired. And neither of them require any experience or learning in order for them to occur. So, with that said, the question is, do humans have modal action patterns? Well, this is kind of an interesting question. Usually we think of modal action patterns as behaviors that ensure survival in a certain species. So they have to have survival value, and they don't occur until adulthood, and they often revolve around feeding and territorial defense and mating and taking care of offspring. And this is especially true. Modal action patterns are present primarily in animals that are not social all year round. So often these animals are not particularly social, and or they have a very small window during which they're going to use these behaviors. So whether it's breeding behaviors or food storing behaviors, sometimes these animals have a very narrow breeding window, for example, and they need to get those seasonal behaviors going quickly in order to be successful. So it makes sense to kind of hardwire them and make them all happen at the same time with all the animals in the herd or in the group so that they can breed and successfully have their babies and move on. Long-lived social species don't need to rely on things like modal action patterns. We don't really need them because we learn. We can rely on reflexes for what we need, and the rest we can learn. So do modal action patterns do humans have modal action patterns? Well, typically professors will say no, they don't. Part of me feels like this is a little bit where the line in the sand has been drawn to separate humans from the animal world. So we say, oh, animals have fixed action patterns, but we don't, we learn. We just have reflexes that we need in super emergencies where we do have to make a quick decision or we could get hurt. The rest we can learn. So we drew a line in the sand and it's the way we've defined modal action pattern that makes it hard to find them in humans. So for example, some people will say, well, what about mothering behavior? Mothering behavior, you know, wanting to nurse your child and hold your child and care for your child. Some people think of that as being like a modal action pattern. It happens, think about the definition, it happens in all members of the species, all females who bear young engage in those behaviors. There's a little bit of variability, but it's pretty much the same for everybody. But if we look more closely at human mothering behavior, it's not like a modal action pattern. We have women who leave their babies in dumpsters. We have women who neglect their babies. We have women who shake their babies. And so the idea of it being a modal action pattern where it's relatively similar for every member of the species, we have lots of cultural values. Some mothers pierce their babies' ears, some don't. There's a lot of differences in the way women mother their children. And so they're really, it really doesn't fit the definition of a modal action pattern, but of course the definition is made by people. So that's a little bit, it's kind of a little slippery slope, I think. The distinction between reflexes and modal action patterns, in some ways I feel like, well, maybe it's more like a continuum rather than like two completely separate things. I mean, I understand that the physiology is different between them, but anyway, the typical answer is no, but I have a question for you. What about reflex contagion? So not the reflex itself, but the reflex being contagious, like yawning. Yawning behavior is seen in lots and lots of animals. It triggers yawning in other individuals, especially in humans. Yawns last about 6 seconds, and once they start, they're hard to stop. Oh, I'm talking about this and it's making me yawn. All I have to do is look at those pictures and it makes me yawn. So they're hard to stop once they start, and it becomes contagious. We can catch it from each other. We look at each other and we see someone yawning and it makes us want to yawn. In fact, are you yawning? It might be happening to you. In 2013, some researchers, Romero, Kono, and Hasegawa, did some research and discovered that pet dogs can often catch yawning from their owners. Speaking of, my dog is grumbling over there. And so not only do people catch it from each other, but there's research to suggest that maybe it's even contagious with our own pets. I'm going to end the video here. I'm going to end the slideshow so you can go watch the last supplemental video for Unit 1D on contagious yawning. And it's a short little news clip, and it's pretty interesting. And so after you watch this, you can ask yourself, could this possibly be the idea that yawning is contagious between people? Is that maybe a modal action pattern? Okay, have a good day. Go watch the video. We'll see you at the next lecture. Bye.